This is Sarah Mikesell with the Pig Site, working in collaboration with Lifestart Swine. And today we're online with Dr. Derald Holtkamp. He's a professor of swine production medicine at Iowa State University in Ames, Iowa, here in the United States. Dr. Holtkamp's research has focused on the management of infectious swine diseases, biosecurity, disease risk assessment, and the economics of animal health and disease with an emphasis on PRRS and PEDV. Thanks for being with us today, Derald.
Glad to be here, Sarah.
Economically damaging diseases like PRRS and PDV continue to plague pig producers, not to mention concerns over African swine fever entering North America. And today we want to talk about biosecurity and what producers can do to try to keep disease out. Let's start with how to assess biosecurity on a farm and why it's important.
Yeah, that's a good place to start, Sarah. I think why to do it is so that you can identify where the biosecurity hazards are, the most significant ones, and then prioritize those. And so why is that important? I think to answer that question, you sort of have to look at a little bit at our recent history. That's recent being the last 3 or 4 decades. And this is particularly in the US, but around the world, where we've really revolutionized how we raise pigs. And so if you go back 30, 40 years, things were farrow to finish, and you had all independently owned local producers. They provided the labor, had an on-site feed mill, natural mating, so they weren't bringing semen and feed in on a regular basis. And fast forward to today, now we've got what could easily be described as a very open production system now, where we're bringing things in all the time, right? So we have to bring in the semen, bring in the feed, we bring in employees every day. And so now, that we have lots of opportunities for the pathogens to enter the farm. And if you look at other biological industries, like, say, for example, the food industry or ethanol production, or even biopharmaceutical industry, they really strive to create what would be described as a closed biological production system, where those introduction of those bacteria, viruses, and other things can really wreak havoc if they get into let's say a batch at the wrong time. And so they try to close everything up once they sort of establish a batch, or once they got everything in place, and not bring new things in, new supplies, new ingredients, those kinds of things. And we've really taken the opposite approach in the pig industry, and we've done that for good reason. It's a very cost efficient model, but we do have to recognize that that at the same time, it's created a production model that is just ripe with biosecurity hazards. And there's to the point where it's so complicated now to look at that we really have to have an approach to assess those biosecurity hazards, and then be able to say, okay, where are the ones that we want to prioritize first? And so to do that, we've been working on an approach here the last 10 years, let's say, maybe even going back further than that, that allows us to assess those biosecurity hazards. And we describe that as a biosecurity hazard analysis. And to do that, what you have to do is you have to look at where those biosecurity hazards lie, and they lie in the production processes, and not just sort of a cursory look at those. In order to identify them, you have to look at the details. So who does things, how do they do them, when do they do them, what do they do them with, who, what, when, where, and how of those production processes. And so again, that now is what we describe as a biosecurity hazard analysis, is going in as a first step and trying to assess where those biosecurity hazards lie.
And when is the best time to conduct a hazard analysis?
Yeah, I think arguably you would say the best time is before outbreaks occur in sow farms in particular, right? What I found, though, is that human nature is such that we tend to respond more energetically, let's say, to crises. And so arguably outbreaks of, let's say, PRRS virus or PD on sow farms is arguably a crisis, right? And so what I found is that that's the time when producers and veterinarians are most interested, most willing to spend time to actually do a biosecurity hazard analysis well, and then take action in response to that. And so, we're not going to prevent the outbreak that already happened, but
Right.
it's going to I think is a good way to prevent the next outbreak. What I've kind of come to the conclusion is that it's probably better not to fight human nature, and
Yeah.
just go with the crises, right? And try to learn the most we can from those and take advantage of those. But arguably, if you can muster the energy and the willpower to do them before the outbreaks occur, that's the best time.
Very good. And it might be that a neighboring farm breaks, right? And that's the inspiration, right? To say it's, it happens, and we got to be more diligent, right? Any of those kind of opportunities, I guess, to kind of to get your whole team's mindset around doing something like this, I would think are good opportunities for producers, right?
Yeah, that's kind of what happened when African swine fever virus got into China in the U.S. here, right? We sort of, it
Right.
scared everybody to the extent that we responded to that.
Interesting. Interesting. So, what tips do you have for producers to assess biosecurity hazards on the farm?
So to do that, then what we've tried to do is develop a systematic and comprehensive approach to doing that. And so what I did initially, going back again 10, probably even 15 years ago now, is I really started to study how people, and veterinarians in particular, did outbreak investigations, and then how they used that information to learn. And what I found was it was all over the board, very ad hoc approach. Some veterinary clinics, I would say, had some forms and things like that they used
Mhm.
kind of approach, but they weren't comprehensive in any way. And so what I decided, or what I thought was important, and I think in hindsight that has proven true, is we needed a more systematic and a comprehensive way to do this, kind of a standard way of doing that, if you will. And so one of the things that we did here, going back now, been a couple of years ago, we put a group of veterinarians together, a working group, and a few academics involved in that as well, and came up with what we describe now as a standardized outbreak investigation program. And we did that with some funding from the Swine Health Information Center. And we put that together now, and put that before the board of the American Association of Swine Veterinarians, and got their endorsement of that. And so we're really kind of promoting that then as a standardized way of doing outbreak investigations. And by doing it that way, again, the advantage is being systematic and comprehensive, but we can also start to collect some data from other, multiple outbreak investigations, and hopefully start to learn from that. And so, again, no matter what country you're in, I think it's important, again, to recognize that these outbreak investigations are great opportunities to learn, a great time to do a hazard analysis to identify, the high priority hazards, so that you can then devote your resources to addressing those.
A little bit more about that, Dr. Holtkamp, about where do you focus, right? Where do you put your focus?
Yep.
You do this.
So
There's so much, right? There's so much. There's people coming on the farm, people going off the
yeah,
farm, equipment coming on the farm, dead piles, all these different things. How do you really focus, I guess, your resources and your time and energy on the right things?
yeah, yeah. That's a good question. And so typically what we do, Sarah, then is at the end of the outbreak investigation, we can look at what we describe as entry events. And so entry events might be entry of feed. It might be removal of dead pigs, because you have to enter something to get those pigs off the site, right? So we refer to those as entry events, and that's how our biosecurity hazard analysis and our outbreak investigations are organized anyway. And at the end of that, then we will subjectively rate those as high, medium, or low. And so it's basically just stepping back, taking in all the things into account, all the things we learned during the investigation, and then identifying which of those entry events we think are the most significant problem today, right? And just a recent example, we did an investigation where it was dead removal, and we identified the way they were doing that was by far, we thought, their most significant, had the most significant biosecurity hazards associated with it. And so just last week, we had a follow-up call where we had the veterinarians and the upper management on the phone, and we kind of went through that and, talked more about the processes, the production processes that they have in place for dead removal. And at the end of that, we had the foundation for them to think about, okay, how do we fix that, right? Where do we implement biosecurity practices or control measures? In some cases, that's just simple changes in the process, right? And so that we had laid the groundwork for them to do that. So it'll take probably a couple, 3 more conversations at least for them to assess then, okay, what's the best way we want to do that? And then it'll require them to step back and say, okay, what do we think we can do well? What fits within our production system? Do we have the resources to invest in that right now? And so forth. Those types of questions need to work through. But this is a process then to help them do that or get started on that.
And who all is involved in this process when you think about doing an analysis or an assessment, I guess, Derald? Is it, you're obviously brought in potentially, but who else on the farm is involved with this?
Yeah, I have identified as a minimum the people we need at the table are the farm manager or the site caretaker, and then the herd veterinarian. So the veterinarian who's in charge of that. We oftentimes will have others there at the table as well when we do that initial outbreak investigation. Almost always, though, the goal of that initial investigation is to identify again those areas that we may identify as being high and warranting resources to address it. Oftentimes there's follow-up though, right? So the herd veterinarian and farm manager, for example, may not know a lot about what happens at the truck wash. They may just know generally, let's say, for example, the trucks are supposed to get washed and disinfected and dried. But when we start drilling down on the details about how do they flush, how do they get rid of the organic matter? Do they flush? Do they have a manual scrape? What disinfectant to use? What concentration is used? How do they apply? Oftentimes, if they haven't been out there recently or haven't been involved in those discussions, they don't know. So that motivates them then to go there and find out. And the result of that may be, okay, this is an area we need to focus on. So that's kind of the process and who's involved in each step, and that that if those follow-up things do occur, then they need to involve the appropriate people, right? So the people involved in transport who are making those decisions or let's say responsible for making them happen. And so then it varies by system. Every production system is different, but to start with, we need the farm manager and the veterinarian, and then it kind of expands from there depending on where we identify as priority areas.
Very good. And a final question, I guess, as you just said, every farm is different, right? There's so much variability on these farms, but are there hot spots that you generally say, okay, we have to look at this, this, and this, right?
Yeah, I'll preface that by saying, we've dug into that a little bit with some of the PRRS outbreak investigations we've done over the years on sow farms. And again, this would be U.S. specific, Sarah, but what we found was the things that I would say that we worried about probably the most in terms of biosecurity the last 20 years, like entry of semen, entry of gilts. We find that the processes in place for those now are pretty good, not perfect, but generally pretty good, and production systems have addressed that. Where we do see issues, though, commonly are with things like employee entry. And what you recognize with employee entry, first of all, is by far and away the most frequent event that occurs on sow farms. In fact, we never can graph the frequency of those events, employee entry events, with everything else, because the scale is such that it makes everything else just kind of a flat line at the bottom. And so that you have to recognize that. And then the second thing you have to recognize with employees is that we have almost no control over what they do when they're away from the farm. And so we can put some rules in place, but we don't really have a good way to monitor and police that. So, when you add those two, it puts a lot of pressure on trying to mitigate that any contamination of employees before they enter the farm. And when we first started doing these, we primarily relying on showers to do that. And we saw lots of problems with that, right? It's not uncommon to see towels on the dirty side of the shower, and shower set up so it's not really a true line of separation. So lots of problems with that. And so we've identified employee entry as a high risk entry event on a lot of these sow farms. And so been some things going on in recent years with benches and things like that to address that, but still big issue. The other was cull sow removal and repair events done inside the barn. And cull sow removal, I think you got to recognize that even though you don't have animals coming in, you've got a truck and a driver showing up there at the farm, and oftentimes how those were getting done was just ripe with hazards. And then the on-site or in the barn repair events, those are often emergencies, and so they have to get done right away, and so people take shortcuts. And then the other thing we found is that the people that do these repairs they don't necessarily like to always be told what to do, and they like to kind of control their own work schedules and how they do things. And so we find in many cases where the veterinarian would say this is the way it happens, and we don't do this, and the SOP says this, and then when we follow up and go talk to the people that doing the repairs, and find out, well, it doesn't happen that way, and they do these things. And so that's something we've commonly seen. So yeah, those three: employee entry and cull sow removal and repair events done inside the barn are probably the three that we've seen most often. But it can be anywhere though, Sarah. I don't want to imply that those are the things everybody should focus on. That's really the reason why it's important to assess the biosecurity hazards, because you have to identify those for your own system, your own farm. So
I guess it just goes back to that systematic approach of really walking through the whole process, right? It's got to be comprehensive to really eke out these areas that are whatever the problem is, I guess, on your operation.
Yep, that's right. And if you don't do it comprehensively and systematically, I don't know how you have any confidence in the results and confidence enough to invest major time and other resources.
Very good. Well, thank you, Dr. Holtkamp, for all the information today. We really appreciate it.
Oh, glad to do it again, Sarah.
This is Sarah Mikesell with the Pig Site.